So my name is Mika-Petteri Törhönen. I am lead specialist on land of the World Bank, and I am based in Singapore, and I work on East Asia Pacific and South Asia regions broadly on land issues. Our opening remarks will be today given by practice manager Francis Kesquier of the World Bank's East Asian Pacific region. He's a practice manager on urban land and resilience affairs. Without further ado, I'll give floor to Francis. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mika, and welcome everyone. And more than some opening address, I'm really here to welcome everyone and to congratulate you for joining. I want to congratulate both the organizers and the participants. I think at the World Bank in particular, but I'm sure in the UR community in general. For years now, we've been looking at and wanting to bring together and create links between these two communities, the people who work on disaster risk management, and the people who work on land management, because we can see that first we use a lot of the similar tools, but with very, very different approaches, very different philosophies. But at the same time, it's very obvious that both communities can benefit from each other. And that's actually the spirit of understanding risk, is bringing people from completely different walks of life, but who look at the same problem, because from this kind of meeting comes innovation, comes new ideas, new project, and in fact, better result on the ground. So welcome to everyone. Congratulations. I wish you a fantastic panel discussion today, and I look forward to the conclusion in about an hour. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mika.
Thank you very much, Francis. Welcome everybody to this, in case you've been clicking while Francis was opening this session on land and geospatial systems and resilience. I am pointing you to having a look at the chat box and opening a poll website to be ready for our very challenging questions coming your way during this show. We will now go into the umbrella presentation. It's going to be given by Professor Abbas Rajabifard from the Center for Disaster Management and Public Safety of the University of Melbourne. Abbas is a scholar who has been involved in this work of ours that we've been doing some 2.5 years, connecting the dots between the disaster risk management profession and land tenure and geospatial professions. And Professor Abbas, you will have about 10 minutes for this presentation. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mika, and hello everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you today to sharing the journey that we have gone through together, led by Dr. Mika and also Federico and the rest of the colleagues from the World Bank, and also the other colleagues from our university, Dr. Katie Potts, as well as also a number of consultants that we had from different countries. So that was absolutely a great pleasure to working and practicing in this particular area, to highlighting the importance of land and geospatial system to improve community and also infrastructure resilience. Let me, Federico, please, the next slide. When we look at to the disaster, Federico, thank you. When we look at the global trend, we can see that the climate change, as well as also again the pressure that we are getting from different areas, we are keep getting actually again increased frequency of the disasters. And are we ready really for that or not? And one is that when we go further forward, then we can see that due to the other type of disaster, we're getting actually some steps backward. So therefore, we really need to look at today ways that we can respond back At the same time, also coming up with the areas that how people, when they affected by disaster, they're actually leaving their land and belonging and going to other places, so displacement. That therefore we need to look at to the location and see how this land and infrastructure and land and geospatial information would actually support this. The next slide, please. Federico, please, the next slide. So when we look at again to the disaster around the world, we can see that the better access, sorry, go back to the next previous one. So the importance when we look at to the better access to the land and geospatial information, which is critical for disaster risk management. And in particular, this would actually helping us with the tenure, land use and land valuation and zoning, which would help for planning, monitoring, and also implementing responses to before, during, and after disasters. So therefore, this is an angle that we wanted to focus on through this project. Please, the next slide. But the value of the land, when we see this, and due to the disaster, when this disaster actually affecting the displaced people, and therefore, when people actually forced to leave their homes, and also, again, they leave everything behind, in particular about their ownership and also the land and property. So therefore, we need to look at to the key which is the land information, which would be the key ensuring for comprehensive and securing that type of ownership. And this is information about the what, who, and where, and how much. And this is about their, again, compensation as well as also protection of their ownership. Many of the disasters that we have seen and casualties that we had been because of the people not being sure that if they leave their land, they can actually claim it back. So therefore, it is very important, and without this information, it is almost impossible for countries to develop proper disaster response or preparedness plans. Next slide, please. So having said that, that is the part that this project, perhaps as a motivation for us to moving through this, to look at to the disaster when we look at today, not only on the economic, but also on the people, and also the most valuable asset, which is the land and property. At the same time, also the land and geospatial information as a fundamental for effective implementation of disaster risk management. These are the two foundations for us, the way that we try to come up with the approach. Next slide, please. So therefore, the project has been funded and supported by the World Bank to coming through this, and we have adopted the country case study approach to assessing different areas from the different jurisdictions to developing some of those practices and examining to this, and also coming up with the approach that would assist for the improvement of the resilience by improving the land and geospatial maturity for the countries. For doing that fund, we have adopted series of models as well as also development of a maturity metrics to assessing the resilience status. Therefore, we arrive to the, if we have a mature land administration system, at the same time also comprehensive geospatial information, these are the two that would help to the risk management. At the same time, we also try to adopt the IGIF. This is an international geospatial information framework developed jointly by World Bank and also UNGGIM. And this is a framework, again, we have tried to examining this to see how best we can align and also coming out with a roadmap that would assist the countries. To doing this, then we arrive into the series of recommendations and also tools that we have developed to helping. And then with the support of the World Bank over the last 2 years, we have gone through a number of countries to testing this and refining the value and also the scope of the work. Next slide, please. As a result of this work, the outcome of this have been around series of measures. we have conducted detailed around the 8 country case studies, which you can see the names of this. This is in addition to the other 2 countries, in particular Australia, as well as also Norway, that we have conducted to learning some of the best practices that they have and then applying into these areas. And then we develop a tool that would actually, again, the 3 components or lenses that would provide us with, and then also series of international events and the detail and focus type workshop we have conducted. And also what you can see, the 7 operational mission to India and also Solomon Island and Nepal. As a result of this, now there are other also measures and areas that World Bank is pursuing and driving this, which we are hoping that this particular outcome, which arrive into the solid foundation to supporting us into the improving the resilience. Another dimension that we have tried to address here is the connectivities between these elements of the resilience and also sustainability. The 2 elements together would address this. By this, I would like to return it back to the chair, and hopefully this provided the foundation that we can provide some good conversation. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Abbas, and thank you very much to your and the university's input for this work. So we have a publication out. Federico will, my colleague Federico, who has organized this session, can send you a link in the chat later to that publication, which captures all the wisdom that we created. I'm also pointing you to the chat that there is a website link, and you should click there now, because as the next step in this very interactive session, we will be asking you a question. So we are asking you to open the website and click on the region where you think people have the highest risk of becoming a victim of a disaster globally. So let's start clicking. I will be contributing from here as well. I have done my click. And we'll give you a little bit time for clicking. So if you haven't found this yet, please go into the chat box and click there. I see several people responding. And we're giving another 30 seconds so everybody feels. I think there are very good answers coming through. I'm a little bit curious about the UK one, but that that might be hard to. It may be a statement by someone, but I don't know. But I can very well understand the Caribbean clicking, and then Central Africa ones for sure as well, and especially when we're looking at violent conflicts and so on. But I think there is a clear winner here. We can see that most of us are clicking whereabouts. I am sitting in Singapore and south from here, and definitely towards east to the Pacific. And indeed, East Asia Pacific is the world's most vulnerable region. And we, among the 171 countries that have been measured for UN's World Risk Index, we have countries in the Pacific like Vanuatu, which is leading that list. We have Philippines, that is third on the list. And then we have Tonga, who is second in the list. And so the next person we're going to be hearing from is living in a country that is second most vulnerable and risky place to live in the world. So let me introduce Rosamund Bing, who is a Chief Executive Officer of the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources in Tonga. She has been a senior leader for a long time there. She's also leading a UN GGIM, the Geospatial framework work in the UN system. and she's very well known to our land and geospatial community. So let us ask you, Rosamund, on your experience and your thinking on how important is a sound geospatial framework for disaster risk resilience and preparation.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Tonga. It's midnight here, but it's good to be online and to be able to have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and observations. From my experience, I think it's critical to have access to accurate geospatial information when disaster strikes. I've been involved with project reconstruction and land acquisitions for a tsunami event and several tropical cyclones in the past 8 to 10 years. What geospatial information does is that it facilitates effective rapid assessments so that the immediate response to communities are effective. Geospatial information also plays a very key role in coordination of stakeholders and disaster agencies during initial disaster assessment. Tonga is blessed to be COVID-free, but during our initial lockdown and closing of our borders, we were hit in April with a Category 5 tropical cyclone, Tropical Cyclone Harold. What geospatial information has proven to us is that access to accurate information is key. During the Tropical Cyclone Harold, it was very key to identifying post-disaster assessment to identify for this particular cyclone. It hit the coastal areas by devastating storm surges because the event was combined with high tide inundation. So this event caused heavy devastation and destruction to coastal tourist facilities, to our maritime transportation and wharves, and to several residential areas. So it was a very unique event. So what geospatial information supported and for us in this event was it enabled us to identify the extent of the damage in the different areas. And by doing that, we used the previous information that had been compiled, recorded from 2 previous disasters, 2 previous tropical cyclones, and to use the updated aerial images for Tropical Cyclone Harold. By then, we were able to determine the degree, the level of damage, and that enabled us to mobilize our assistance and our resources to those areas that were more severe and required assistance. So in my experience, it's critical to have access to geospatial information during disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosamund. Very strong words, and that interesting repository function of also historical geospatial information is critical for the in-depth analysis in these things. So very strong points. Now, let's move on to Keith Bell, a senior specialist here in the land team of the World Bank, and a long career in working with countries, vulnerable countries, and on all sorts of contexts. But one of the highlights that perhaps, and I'm saying that not you, of your career may have been the preparing a project in
Mika, you are on mute.
My goodness, you lost all the great commentary. I'm gonna go then shorter. Sorry for that. Thank you, Rosamund, very strong words. And I said many more words, but I will not repeat them. I just say they were strong words and I agree. And I'm turning to Keith. Keith Bell, a senior specialist of the World Bank, who has a long career on working on land and geospatial systems and countries vulnerable and in transition globally. And perhaps, Keith, one of the very critical roles you have had in your career was when you went to Banda Aceh just after the tsunami and helped to prepare or led to the preparation of a land project in response to disaster the tsunami created there. I wonder, your first, you were one of the first people going there. Did you see the vulnerabilities we're talking about in terms of losing your property, losing your inheritance, losing your assets? And did you see perhaps something that you would call as somebody taking advantage of those vulnerabilities?
Yeah, hi, Mika. Greetings from Bangkok, everyone, where it's about 6:20 at night time. Strangely enough, the tsunami in Indonesia was almost my first experience in the World Bank. I'd only been in the World Bank for about 12 months, and it was in about February of 2005. I first went to Banda Aceh and also other parts of that were affected by the tsunami in Aceh and in North Sumatra. And the thing that struck me, particularly during that first visit in February, was the absolute, I'll use the word paranoia in a guarded sense. People were going crazy putting stakes in the ground to mark out their land because they were so concerned about it being grabbed. Even when the land was inland and inundated, it was this huge fear. And about exactly the same time, we were looking at what was going on in other parts of countries that were affected by the Indian Ocean tsunami. And we learnt about Thailand. I mean, Thailand had this great reputation because of the 3 World Bank land projects and all these other sorts of things. And there was a company called the Pacific East Coast Development Company, which had a deal with the Thai Department of Lands people, where they grabbed the lands of people that were affected by the tsunami. And this was absolutely, I've never seen what happened to the end of that. But when a colleague of mine, Wales Akut, and I learned of this, we were very, very quick to advise the Badan Pertanahan Nasional, the land agency of Indonesia, to do something to ban any form of land transfer in the tsunami affected areas of Aceh and North Sumatra. And they did. They issued a decree, a Perpu as it was called, and that stayed in force for many, many years. On the ground, it was even more serious. I was particularly grateful for the Sharia court representatives to reach out to us, along with some of the CSOs, who were very concerned about the rights of orphans and widows, the heirs to people who died in the tsunami. We had villages in Aceh where 93% of the people had died, and the only survivors were young kids. And so we put a lot of effort into training, working with civil society and things like that to overcome these things. So it was really very, very serious. And I can honestly say I never sat in the corner and saw anyone grabbing land, but these risks did happen. There was a bit of a resurgence about this fears a little bit several years afterwards, particularly as the tsunami memories sort of started to fade away a little bit and coastal land became a little bit more desirable again. But it was always there, and I think we have a lot of gratitude to the then head of BPN, Pa Lutfi, for ensuring that there was this decree put in place to prevent land grabbing. Back to you, Mika.
Thank you, Keith. I had the privilege, not a pleasure, but the privilege to join you in one of the missions there. It was really dramatic to see the impact there, and I can relate to somehow to the what you call the fear of losing your assets and properties there. We will now turn into Professor Colleen Butcher College. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, from the University of Melbourne, who many of us know as very knowledgeable specialist on Pacific urbanization, urban planning, and land issues. And we would like to ask you, Professor Colleen, on what kind of urban specific issues you have witnessed, but more so about the customary tenure and the vulnerability that Pacific Islands, or perhaps resilient strength, the Pacific Islands have specific with their very strong prevalence of customary tenure arrangements and culture. So off to you, Colleen.
Thank you, Mika, and thank you for the opportunity of joining this interesting discussion today. I should point out, and people that are from the Pacific or know the Pacific would recognize this, but perhaps for those of you that aren't that familiar with the region, it's made up of a number, quite a large number of small island nations, and the land tenure situation in each country is rather different and rather discrete. At first blush to an outsider, it's all rather opaque, but as one lives and works in some of these island countries, the principles behind land allocation, land ownership, land use rights, and so on, become more and more practical, and one can see through a lot of that opaqueness as one spends time there. And obviously to the people living in these islands, the land tenure system works. These are countries that have been settled continuously by people for 3,000 years or more. And you mentioned the top two most disaster prone, Vanuatu, Tonga, and I'm sure in the next 10 top you'd find Fiji, Samoa, and others. These are people who have over the millennia literally managed to use the land not only for their livelihoods and their well-being, but also to sustain themselves through some pretty severe extreme weather events. I'd like to say that on the whole, I personally believe this continues to a large extent, especially in what we call the outer islands. In another region, we might call these the rural areas. In the outer islands, there are any number of land use rights, coping mechanisms that people have learnt through the ages and are passed down through the ages. This goes through some of the training of specialist builders who put together what we might call the town halls, the nakamals, the maniabas, the kind of the village halls. And these are built to sustain and do sustain, for example, in Vanuatu, many of the nakamals manage to withstand Category 5 cyclone events. So that tradition is there, and certainly some of the islands that are more fragile, traditional leaders have kept aside over the ages, and these are used more for fishing rights or for fallback in times of drought or other kinds of, we sometimes think of disasters as, cyclones, tsunamis and so on, but there's also drought in many of these island countries. Where these systems really start to fall down, and I think the Pacific is no different from other regions in this, is when people start to come to towns. Now, we know that people come to town looking for opportunity. We know that cities are the engines of growth of countries around the world, and the Pacific is no different. People look for opportunity, they look for ways out of poverty. In the case of the Pacific, given the remoteness of some of the outer islands, they also come to towns looking for, let me call them tertiary services, so the high schools, the more specialized hospitals and so on. The Pacific is rapidly urbanizing. It has been urbanizing, but in a kind of hidden way from the policymakers for the last couple of decades. And it's where the urbanization process has largely been ignored by the formal land systems that one really starts to see disasters striking. So the hazards are there all the time, but when they hit the denser urban settlements, where some of the traditional construction methods fall apart, the traditionally available materials are not available, and increasingly, because the urban planning, the urban land management systems have not kept pace with the growth of the urban and peri-urban areas, access to land is completely choked in many, many of the countries. And this particularly impacts the poor who don't have many options, who need to live close to where employment is. And, you know, to give you an example, in Kiribati, it can take 2.5 years to get a formal lease registered. In Vanuatu, a study has found, I think it was 638 working days or something to get a formal lease registered. So a poor person who has a, you know, young family, got to go out to work every day, doesn't have much buffer, is going to make use of those traditional remaining kinship ties to access customary lands. And very often in the peri-urban areas of the Pacific cities and towns, these are oftentimes on the most hazardous land or at-risk land. And that's where, you know, some of the things are starting to fall apart. And we've certainly got studies, the World Bank's been involved in many of these studies that show that after, for example, Tropical Cyclone Winston in Fiji, Tropical Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, Rosamond's in Tonga, I'm sure some of the Cyclone Waka, Cyclone Ian and so on. Some of the worst impacted are the peri-urban people living in unplanned and informal settlements. And it's not only to do with the strength of the cyclone, it's also to do with
Professor Colleen, I'm afraid I will have to ask you to conclude. No, you go ahead and finish, please.
I think I've made my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to interrupt. I think you brilliantly described the situation when tenure systems are in transition and urbanization triggering it and commercialization of land relations. And I would agree with you strongly that this is where perhaps something new is needed, or where the systems haven't been able, the formal systems haven't been able to cope with the customary system transition. I do not have as in-depth knowledge as you have or experience, but that's I can confirm your vision, that exactly what we saw in Solomon Islands as well. I'm going to go back to Professor Abbas now. And we have heard that in Tonga, we made a case that geospatial infrastructure is a key for knowing what happened and targeting responses and what not. We spoke about the importance of land relations and securing tenure in the cases of disaster. So you have been educating now couple of generations of land people as disaster risk management specialists as well. What do you see? Are these issues being adequately addressed in global responses on disasters? I'm afraid we can't hear you, Abbas.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very good question that you just raised, Dr. Miko. The short answer is no. I mean, we haven't actually got into that level of resiliency yet, meaning that we haven't got all the data requirement for the foundation to support every jurisdictions worldwide. We have made good progress in several ends, and also the new technologies available to us today to helping with the collections of with the use of the technology, different forms, and then preparing and connecting this type of a foundation data set to support the resiliency. But not all the countries actually are able yet into this, not because of the technology, lack of the technology. It is actually, there are other dimensions like the institutional arrangement, the policy arrangements, and also perhaps, I mean, cultural issues associated with that as well. So we can see that there is still more room to improve, and we need to focusing more onto this and connecting this one and leveraging off the other type of framework that we have, like IGIF, like SDGs, and the other also, again, the efforts that being done by international communities. At the same time, World Bank has been funding several countries into this to improving the resilience and infrastructure protection. So therefore, by making those information available to address and use, and I think what Colleen has indicated about the needs of the different sorts of information that would help from the security of tenure, as well as also preparing the digital, like digital twin or other type of metaphor that would assist this kind of connectivities here. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Abbas. So we will get back a little bit, if time permits, into the digital twin aspect. And what I'm seeing is that the awareness is raising, knowledge is raising. So maybe the next step is that the conduct will improve. I'd like you to point you again to the chat box, and there we have a URL address to polling station. We have a question now. What do you think is the most important feature of land administration in the context of disaster risk management? And I'm going to do my clicking just now. I will not tell you. We have a freedom of election here. Click. I've done my choice. Our polling is leaning towards land tenure, the rights, the security of rights being the most important feature of land administration systems, while planning and control of land use is competing, but clearly backmarking a little bit here. And you have paid less importance to land development, construction permits, and land valuation. Very interesting. Let's go back to Rosamond. I would like to ask you about the land administration system in Tonga. What do you think are your main challenges in this regard in terms of a disaster, as we know, will be hitting you again? Unfortunately, you are in the zone. So what are your challenges in terms of the land tenure, security of rights, and the land control of land use, and these aspects we just pulled off? Off to you, Rosamond.
Thank you very much. I think we've had some interesting thoughts already shared by my fellow panelists. Colleen had described already some context behind the land administration and tenure in the Pacific. Tonga is quite unique in the sense that land administration is currently centralized. So I look after a ministry that centralizes land administration, survey services, land and geographical information systems, and town planning and planning as well. So all services related to land is centralized in this ministry. Now, that doesn't mean that we're efficient. It just means we're centralized, and you still have challenges in coordinating efforts of the ministry itself. But the land administration is highly regulated by a constitution. We have a written constitution, and we have a land act and a land court that oversights the work and the administrative decisions that we make. Now, Tonga is unique as well in that whilst our land administration and our land tenure system was built on the foundation of culture and tradition, we have a registrable title system. So only registered land rights are recognized. So as you can imagine, the key challenge for myself and the government and our partners when we are responding to disasters and when we are going implementing reconstruction projects is to reconcile the land tenure system with the need to provide post-disaster reconstruction. And how do we address providing climate-proof, cyclone-proof, safe housing for our people, but who don't own land, do not have registered land. So after 4 tropical cyclones, I think Tonga and our partners have worked through finding measures to bridge this gap between ensuring that the most vulnerable people in disasters and victims are not displaced and that they're not further victimized. So one example is we've developed a consent form that secures occupancy over a long-term period for people who suffered during the cyclone. And while they may not own land, we're able to secure occupancy rights from the landholder, and they can live in the new house that's been built. So I think that's a key challenge, but over the years, I think working together and putting our thoughts to being more creative, innovative has allowed us to ensure that our people are safe. And like you said, this is going to be an ongoing process, and each event has its own challenges. But I think we're understanding that we have to work rather hard to ensure that we find different ways to ensure that our people are protected, especially in a post-disaster situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you pointed to the international trend anyway, which is to secure tenure of everybody, secure tenure of every land user and landowner and landholder, regardless of whether they are legal title holders. And I think that's an important aspect of what you said and where the world is going, not least because of for example, the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure. I see Vladi joining from FAO, who's hosting that instrument, and which is very strongly advocating everybody's tenure security right, not only legal title holders. I'm going to Keith now. Keith, you are using sometimes the term authoritative, and I can't pronounce it, authoritative geospatial data. And why is it important that geospatial data is authoritative, and what is the point here in authoritative geospatial data in terms of improving resilience?
Yeah, thanks, Mika. Well, of course, if you haven't got authoritative, as you said, authoritative data, which is usually data produced by government or someone on behalf of government, you've got to go with what you've got. Let me just very quickly, in the couple of minutes I've got, just give you a couple of examples. If you took, for example, Aceh, North Sumatra after the tsunami, even though there was a national mapping agency, which was then called Bakasutnal, they didn't share any information. Even though international governments, including military, captured extensive mapping at very suitable scales, AusAid reported 15 times the National Mapping Agency refused to share any of that authoritative, well-prepared information. For the work we did for land, I had to beg, and I got support from the European Commission to get €500,000 worth to produce our own mapping using satellite imagery and technical assistance. So even if you have got authoritative information, if government agencies refuse to share it, it's no good to anyone. And that was the early experiences of Indonesia. The current National Mapping Agency there is very, very good in terms of sharing information. The types of information you're particularly interested in is cadastral information, the cadastre, roads information, elevation information, street address information, and of course, basic topographic information. Very, very important. And I use these terms because I have an early disaster background in Australia with Emergency Management Australia and Displan. And that's why I keep going back to these things. Geospatial information in a digital sense has just come along. The particular stage of the disaster too is very important. The type of information that you may require for risk management is not necessarily the type of information that you require for actually reconstruction. For example, typically you'll see on the DRM side, relatively coarse elevation information. You can't use that for construction engineering work where you need information at better than a foot, 0.3 of a meter. So that's very, very important. In some situations where there's no information and there's no one coming in to provide authoritative information like the military, you've had good organizations like OpenStreetMap move in, like we saw in Haiti in 2011. And they did some excellent work in providing some very, very basic data until, of course, good information became available with other organizations like the US military going in there. But then, of course, I'd like to give you the context of authoritative versus volunteer information. We saw in the Philippines after Typhoon Yolanda, where they were doing the damage assessment work, where OpenStreetMap people and their teams, volunteers, were doing a lot of work. The American Red Cross published a report in 2014 showing how unreliable that information was because the volunteers didn't use standards. They followed the media hype of, you know, oh, it was supposed to be highly damaged, so it must be. So there was reportings of errors of up to 200% in mistakes. Some of the other types of things where I've seen issues with authoritative information going wrong is where you have countries which have ports, where you have port datums, which are typically concerned with lowest astronomical tide, and geospatial people coming in, not understanding the difference between datums and mixing terrestrial elevation information, which is measured above sea level, versus something which is measured above lowest astronomical tide, and it can be many, many meters of difference. So not only is it authoritative information, but the people who are using it must know how they're using it. They must understand the data itself. Hopefully there's metadata available, standards and so forth. And so with all the information, it's exercising caution and know what you're doing with it all. But again, you know, you do need certain types of information for the different phases of the disaster cycle. And typically that cycle consists of 4: preparation, response, recovery, and mitigation. So it's good if you've got it. If you haven't got it, you've got to go with what you've got in terms of geographic information. And when you can work with much better quality stuff, share it around and continue to improve and build on the data, continuously improve it. And that will, of course, help build future resilience. Back to you, Mika.
Thank you. Standards, quality, coverage, sharing. I think those are words of wisdom. And quite often, I guess we are in a situation where the authoritative data is not so much available. And it is fantastic that we have these new ways of filling that void. But you also made a strong case on why do we actually need also that authoritative stuff. Now, of course, our game plan is completely messed up. We are about halfway through our list of questions and so on, but we are close to through the session. So I think we should return next year. However, I'm going to ask a couple of questions from our panelists, but why don't you, in parallel, go to your website? There is a question on how would you rank the following fundamental geospatial data sets for disaster risk management? Which is the most important geospatial data set for this purpose? Go and rank it. Let us go to Colleen then. You have been working in urban areas in Pacific for a very long time. So what role has the geospatial information played in that work, and what kind of good and bad experiences you have had?
Thanks, Mika. You know, probably my experiences lead quite well on from what Keith was talking about. Sometimes the real difficulty and the challenge on the ground is how do you translate the science for the public to understand, and translate it in a way that you're building the knowledge, but you're also changing attitudes and you're changing practices. How do you get that across? And very oftentimes the science is out there, it's being very well done, but translating it is pretty difficult. And almost in parallel with that, we have, you know, community-led kind of subjective analyses of disaster risk or subjective analyses of perceived risk and so on. How do you kind of bridge the gap here? Well, I think there are a couple of good practices that have happened in the Pacific. I can think of other areas as well. I also work in Southeast Asia where there's pretty good practices there. But in the Pacific specifically, you know, looking at Vanuatu, for example, the World Bank with GFDRR support carried out what was called a mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and analytical and operational project a few years back. And that, given the high risk setting of Vanuatu, that brought in some pretty sophisticated science to do multiple hazard probabilistic modeling of landslides, tsunami events, coastal overtopping and flooding, riverine flooding. That got translated into maps using a kind of traffic signal light. This is a traffic signal code, is something that's used quite often in New Zealand and Australia, and the consultants working on this mapping were from New Zealand, and they made use of this. And it's been very, very effective. So very simply, you know, government officers who are not geospatial experts, landowners, communities themselves can look at a map and you can see red, orange, green, and you immediately get a really clear picture of what's going on there. Now, of course, devil in the detail, when you get site specific, you've got to do a little bit more than that. But that information then played into about 63 or more community village mapping exercises of then communities themselves around Greater Port Vila area and Luganville, the other city, town, mapping for themselves tsunami escape routes and where to put safe shelters, and just making use of this, you know, traffic light kind of mapping that sits behind that. Very quickly, another example, because again, I feel like we think of disasters always with these extreme weather events, but a lot of countries and people who use that poll everywhere looked at the Sahel and parts of North Africa. These are, the disasters there are drought and slow onset drought and that kind of thing. Kiribati, a very low-lying country known for sea level rise, surrounded completely by ocean. It's actually one of the most arid countries in the Pacific. And again, World Bank with some Australian government, GFDRR and GEF funding, had quite a long-term project, the Kiribati Adaptation Program, which included bringing piped water supplies into the villages of South Tarawa, 3 villages on a pilot exercise. You might say, well, geospatially, what's water systems got to do with villages in South Tarawa? Well, the simple fact is that nobody living in these villages, and in fact, probably 2 billion people on Earth everywhere, don't have an address. And so simple things like, you know, how do I get my water bill to you if I'm a water utility? And if you're a household, how do you know that you're getting the correct address? And if you have multiple occupancy on your plot, how do I know that this bill that you're sending me is for me and not the other household that's sharing the plot with me, or that shelter there? So using very simple, it is proprietary, but I'll mention the name, what 3 words, but there's also Google Plus codes. There's any kinds of simple app-based kind of software that's available now of giving people addresses. And this was something that we actually picked up, my colleague Rosamond from Tonga, we picked it up from that the Tongan Postal Services was making use of it. And the Kiribati Postal Services was interested, but another good example of just how you could make use of some of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have an advocate for addresses being high on the list of geospatial. So please, if you haven't yet tried the arrows in the website, please rate your geospatial data sets. Now, I think we are getting to the wire. I'm going to ask Abbas a very short question, and after that, I'm going to give 1 minute to each of the panelists to answer a simple question, basically. Why land and geospatial systems for resilience? And you have some time to prepare, but Abbas, first I have a bonus for you very briefly about next generation technologies. What do you see out there that will make a difference in terms of access to geospatial data and access to land administration services for resilience? Unmute kindly, please.
Sorry. I mean, new technology that can be adopted and used in land administration. When we look at the market and key drivers, when we see that, for example, land modernization agenda, which is actually on top of the many governments agencies today, and which they already actually paying attention to this one. But also when we look at to the technology like IoT or AI or AR, I mean, we're seeing this as a augmented reality or intelligent, and also we're looking for the interconnectiveness between the systems. And then Industry 4.0, when we see this one from the technological trend, and digital economy is another dimension. There are three, perhaps, I mean, areas, Mika. From the data collection, we see the, for example, Earth observation, UAV, LiDAR. I mean, these are the really data set that can be used, and scanning, which becoming much more and cheaper today, as well as data analytics, which is another dimension that we have to pay attention to the new advancement over here for the analytics and machine learning, for example, deep learning that we can get and provide tools, as well as also visualization. And I think that's another angle to communicating the value of the land and ownerships, not only to the, I mean, decision makers, but also to the wider societies, to the citizen in that, or as a citizen-centric here that we can do. So therefore, this is the one that we believe that from the data perspective, technology and societies are driving the data ecosystem. So therefore, we need to look at this, and land and ownership is the core and jewel, actually, again, elements here. And I appreciate, again, Colin has indicated about the address, geocoded national address file. I mean, these are the elements that would assist members to identify immediately any type of location and ownership. Thank you.
Excellent. Another vote for addresses and many other things. So, Federico, can we see the result of the poll? What is the hierarchy of the geospatial data sets in your mind?
Oh, wonderful.
Big vote for auto imagery, I guess, because it has a ability to cover many parts of the downward cycle. Addresses, despite our hard-hitting advocacy here, is losing. I think it's wrong. I think addresses are very important, and I think many cadastral projects, land projects would do well by starting addresses. But anyway, very interesting. Thank you very much for this. And it is interesting to see auto imagery as a winner. I'm also a big advocate of that. Let's go back then to our great panelists, and we don't have now questions from the audience. Thank you for that, because we're running out of time, but let's go to Rosamund first. So from your context, or more generally, why land and geospatial systems for resilience?
Thank you, Mika. I think my closing remark is that when one is equipped with accurate and fit for purpose data and information, then planning and decision making is sound and enduring. And I think Abbas made the comment that's dear to many of our hearts, is that we want to ensure that our people are safe in all circumstances. And that's where land administration and geospatial plays a very fundamental role. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm grateful to have shared my thoughts with yourselves in the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution and wisdom, and thank you for staying up so late and making great remarks. Keith, why land and geospatial systems for resilience?
Yeah, in 3 simple words: to avoid chaos, vulnerability, and hype. Everything happens somewhere. People's rights are somewhere. You need the spatial referencing, and that spatial referencing must be reliable. When you don't have this reliable information, interventionists come in, as we saw in Nepal, where a multilateral was recommending fintechs come in and preach blockchain to the government, and the Ministry of Communications, Information Technology raised concern because they were being hit by all corners because these lobbyists had said how great this stuff was. And the government's saying, but we don't have this digital information. How can you move into blockchain? You know, I heard what 3 words mentioned. That can be a very dangerous thing as well, because it loses the geospatial context in terms of the 3 words. And they aren't always unique despite what they say. So there's lots of issues where you do need some rigor. So, and it becomes a consultant's field day, as we've seen over COVID, where solutions are being preached. So authoritative, reliable spatial data that's accessible, both on the cadastral side and all the other types of things in your list, is absolutely critical. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Keith, and thank you for your wisdom and your long career. And we hope to see you a lot in these vulnerable countries, helping us move forward. Off to Colleen. And look, guys, we are now all vulnerable. This session may end in any minute, so let's keep going until it happens. Colleen, why land and geospatial systems for resilience?
Thanks, Mika. Look, I can't really do much more than echo what Rosamund and Keith have both said. You know, at the end of the day, you can't manage what you can't measure or what you can't monitor. And more and more extreme weather events, more frequently, greater catastrophes happening, disasters happening. We need to better understand the science. Whether they're geospatial or other kinds of disruptive technologies, allows us to leapfrog some of the manual systems of the older times that you know, get us to the answer much more quickly, allows us to keep much more accurate records. And as long as we can be translating that, and if we're using things like what 3 words, making sure we have the GPS coordinates also sitting in the waterboard behind that, you know, so doing it in an authoritative and clever way, a smart way, I guess. Yeah, just to echo what my colleagues have already said, I completely endorse what they said. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you for joining today, and thank you for sharing your wisdom. And we have shared you with the link of the publication. We hope you make use of it and the tools associated. Let's keep going next year again, if not earlier. We have already questions for another session. And Abbas, what are your reasoning on here? What is your reasoning in here? Land and geospatial systems for resilience. Why?
So thank you. I think I go very simple, that these informations are, crucial for planning, monitoring, and also implementing the responses for before, during, and after disasters. So therefore, if we don't have this information, we cannot really plan for that, and also mitigating this. So therefore, the land and particularly the ownership, land tenure, and addressing the information related to the tenure, land use, and land valuation and zoning. And I think these are really important, the 4 functions of land administration that we requires this to do.
Thank you. We have just concluded this session. Thank you very much for everybody's participation. We want to return to this topic, keep it up, and if nothing else in the next understanding risk, but hopefully sooner. And thank you for all the panelists for great remarks, and I hope we made a step forward in this team. And we at the World Bank will keep working on this. So we hope many of you will join us in this work, and feel free to be in touch. Be safe, and good night, good morning, and everything in between. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mika. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And special thanks for Federico for organizing this session.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.